welcome to our project, which is called Oral History of Tibetan Studies. And we would like to ask you about your work and about your work with some of the funding figures of Tibetan studies. That was David Snellgrove, Hugh Richardson, and Michael Aris.
Yeah. Okay. Just as a tiny bit of background, personally, I came in first through Chinese studies and went to China quite early in 1979 and actually had a career in publishing before coming back to academic studies. And both Hugh Richardson and Michael Aris had a very strong influence on me in pushing me farther and farther westward. And indeed, at different times, both Michael and Hugh strongly urged me to try and do something that linked China and Tibet, that showed the interactions and the long history of engagement between China and Tibet. So I have to thank them for that, and then I ended up doing what was in the end most logical and obvious, which is on tea and the whole relationship of tea. But I have to thank Hugh and Michael for urging me to bring the two together, and that's more or less how I fell into doing more serious work in the Tibetan area. I first met Michael around 1990 when he was a guest lecturer, a guest professor at Harvard University, and through a friend who had a pecha, but for a long time didn't know what it was. He was a mountaineer who climbed a great mountain in 1932, and when he came back to America, he had various Tibetan souvenirs, and he had this big pecha, and I knew of Michael Aris, and I called him up and said, "Could you identify this?" And so I walked with this great pecha across Cambridge, Massachusetts, and went to Michael's office, and in about 3 seconds, Michael said, "Oh yes, this is a biography of the fifth Dalai Lama." And so that's how we first met. And in time, he actually hired me to be his assistant. We joked and said I was his ecclesiastical secretary because it was just at the moment that his wife won the Nobel Prize, and he was just overwhelmed. He had reporters from all over the world. He had so many things to organize. And so I became his secretary, his cook, his laundryman, his editor, his assistant. And so Michael and I actually lived closely together for many months. And in all of this time, I got to know him quite well. And two things I remember standing out. First, he was a hugely impractical person when it comes to day-to-day life. He'd already been in America for a year or so, and at one point he pulls out a handful of coins and pushes one forward and says, "What is that?" And I said, "Michael, that's a nickel. That's a 5-cent piece." That's just one small example. Now, on the other hand, when we come to his intellectual strength, it was miraculous to see that in the midst of all of this turmoil and busyness, he had to finish, in fact, he had to write the main text for a book that we were producing together called Lamas, Princes, and Brigands, the photography of Joseph Rock, dealing with Rock's years in the Sino-Tibetan borderlands. And we'd had supper, and it was getting late, And I've never seen anything like it. It was almost like a whirlwind came around him, and he just sat down, and you could just see him focus, and he did it. And it was almost perfect, word for word. And the next day I made a couple of small changes, and it was ready to go. And it was really, really something for me to see just the intensity of concentration that he could bring, and just knock out an outstanding piece of work. And what was important about that piece of work was that long before it became sort of discussed and studied and well known, this whole discussion about center and periphery, about what is space in the spirit and mind and life of local people. In this article, he brings that up and talks about how, especially in Kham, the local chieftains or princelings or kings very much saw their world as the center, and Lhasa and Beijing were far, far away. And so this is the early 90s, and it's only much later that this becomes a real area of focus, and now is, in fact, an important area of of study and understanding. Down deep, of course, you could see the hurt and the sadness in Michael of being separated from Aung San Suu Kyi, his wife. All of the efforts to make contact, and of course, it's a later story about his illness and his failure to ever see her again. But nevertheless, that's something he carried with him, and didn't want to talk about it too much, but you could sense it. And then Michael and I, we over the years did a number of books together, not just The Lamas, Princes and Brigands, but we did The Raven Crown, which is the story of Buddhist monarchy in Bhutan. And it was wonderful. We would, because it's a highly illustrated with all of his marvelous collection of Bhutanese photographs, and we would lay out all the pictures on a great carpet, and it was like a gigantic jigsaw puzzle, and we'd talk and laugh and argue and drink tea and talk more, and trying to decide which pictures to keep and which ones to be full page, half page, and so forth. And that was really a good experience, because it was extremely valuable to bring this material forward. I don't think anyone had accumulated that kind of material on Bhutan. And again, Michael didn't talk much about his early years in Bhutan, but when you talk to Marilor, she can flesh that out. And then later, importantly, it was Michael's idea, I believe, in conjunction with his brother Anthony, his twin brother, to gather together and to publish all of the shorter works of Hugh Richardson. And they brought me on as a kind of gatherer and proofreader, and then particularly helping to organize Hugh Richardson's photographs and create maps for the regions of Tibet that he writes about and talks about. And this, of course, becomes the big volume, High Peaks, Pure Earth. And so that took us a long, long time. And some of these articles, from obscure Indian journals, it was a lot of fun, a bit of a bit of a treasure hunt to find and get all of these articles together and then to get them properly transcribed. And but Michael was very much behind this whole project. And yeah.
How do you remember Michael as a person?
Yes, it's funny with these identical twin brothers, Michael and Anthony. I knew Michael for about a year before he introduced me to Anthony, and then over time I actually got to know Anthony better because my background was in publishing and not in Tibetan studies. And it's wonderful how different they were. Michael was quiet, intellectual. He recognized the differences between himself and his brother, and they would squabble sometimes, and Anthony called him by his boyhood name, called him Mikey. Nobody else I ever heard call Michael Aris Mikey. And Michael would call Anthony Ant sometimes, and no, it was good to see them together like that. Michael knew what he was doing. He knew about his academic life. He referred to himself sometimes as a pratyekya Buddha, that is the selfish Buddha, so-called selfish Buddha, who works on himself, for himself, but is also working towards enlightenment. I think that's the name, is it? Pratyekya Buddha? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And quite generous, thinking of other people, but as I said, quite hopeless at many practical things. And so he was able to organize help around him, whether it was assistance or in some cases getting Buddhist nuns from Burma to come and be his household help and his cooks. Of course, there was the pressure and the worry about his two sons. I won't go into that here. Maybe Marie-Laure can talk about that more. But the difficulty of being a father, quite a detached father, I'm afraid, into his world, into his studies, into his intellectual life, and no mother to help. So it was very difficult, absolutely. Michael, at the end of the day, he liked to have a whiskey, liked to just talk, was interested in a great many things, was a good listener, but then when he got talking, he didn't want to be interrupted, and he absolutely was worth listening to. That's the thing. Gentle, gave the impression of a strong moral person, but you could see constantly underneath the surface a world of worry and contemplation. But we grew quite close, and we would write to each other, we'd telephone each other from time to time. And then I was with him at Christmas, just before Christmas in 1998, and he was complaining about his back trouble, and Anthony, many years previously, had also had back trouble, and so being twins, he presumed it was just a kind of parallel situation as that of his brother, and in this case, of course, it was not. It was cancer, and that was in December, and then by March he was gone. But what I do remember in that time is the incredible energy that he gathered, and the things that he did, particularly his friendship with Prince Charles, and getting Prince Charles on board to fundraise, and ultimately to to try and get something started at Oxford, a permanent Tibetan studies. And again, Marie-Laure and Charles Ramble will be able to tell you that whole history. But that's, it's been such a great thing, and that's, why we're both sitting here also.
And do you know how this idea developed? When Michael started planning it, and if he also had a vision how it would actually look like?
I don't know the full story. Charles Ramble would know that. Just that people had been talking about it for a long time, that Great Britain, with its resources and its history, it was a pity that Tibetan studies was, in a way, quite limited. Of course, there was David Snellgrove at the University of London, and a few other bits and pieces here and there, and of course some Tibet centers. But the vision for a formal center for Tibetan studies, I think Anthony and Michael had been contemplating that for some time, but how it actually came into being, you'll have to talk to Charles and Marie-Laure about that. And indeed, I don't know how the negotiations went here. All I remember is that because Michael was a member of St. Anthony's College, that they approached St. Anthony's first, and for various reasons that didn't work out. Perhaps it was that St. Anthony's was expecting more financial support, but Wolfson then was chosen, but you can find out more about that. But indeed, this was sort of Michael's last great effort, last great project in those final months before he passed away on his birthday. Yeah.
So when you were working on the books with him, how did you choose the topics? Or how did...
Right. I think it's fair to say that Michael was very much on top of things in how he wanted to do them and projects that he wanted to proceed with. So the idea of a book was there, and then we would discuss about the organization, the chapter sequence, and where I came in as a kind of a general editor would be as an overview, and indeed I have a background in photography, and so work quite a lot with the visual imagery and arguing about what's the best way to present a picture, whether a picture has the strength to be a full page spread and so forth. So he would initiate the main ideas. When he passed away, sometime later, Anthony Aris asked me to organize all of Michael's records and files. And so in this warehouse, there were just boxes and boxes and boxes of stuff.
Which warehouse?
It was a warehouse within walking distance, but a fairly long walk from where Anthony lived in Putney, in London, South London. And Anthony, as a publisher, used part of that warehouse for storing his own books, Ser India Publications. And then a big space was cleared for me to work and to catalog all of Michael's books, many of which ended up at the Wolfson Library here. And then his papers, vast amounts of correspondence, envelopes and envelopes and envelopes of miscellaneous stuff. And if I remember correctly, I don't remember the details, but he had 6 major projects that he was working on and that he intended eventually to do. And so I gathered in piles in this warehouse the materials related to these 6 different projects. And somewhere you could find records of what they were. The one that stuck out clearly and which has a history of its own and is now finally coming to completion in the years 2018 and 2019 is what's called the Wise Collection, an amazing find at the British Library that many people have worked on but found too daunting. And now at last, Diana Lange in Germany, who has been working on this for many years, is going to bring this book to fruition. And indeed, the book is dedicated to Michael and to Anthony. We're still working on that. Yeah.
And at this point, Anthony was employing you, and you moved to the UK.
Yes. In 1993, I was in Hong Kong, also working in publishing there. And Anthony felt the need that he'd like somebody on board closer to home, so I came to London in '94. But even before that, on a freelance basis, I had done these projects, and then in the 1990s, worked on Hugh Richardson's material and helped Hugh also prepare books that Anthony would publish. And then later on, such as organizing Michael's papers, these were done as a freelancer, but I was a friend and a part of the family, and we worked easily and well together, so we knew what was happening, and Anthony could boss me around as he pleased, and it worked pretty well.
And could you say something about the background in publishing you had by the time?
Myself?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, I was lucky enough to go to China as early as 1979 for 2 years, 79 to 81. I was just out of university, had done a bachelor's degree in Asian studies, but with language focus, Chinese and Indonesian.
In the USA?
In the USA, at the University of Wisconsin. And there at Wisconsin, I had bumped up against the Tibetan studies people, and in fact, Wisconsin was the first university in America to hire a Tibetan as a professor, and this is Geshe Sopa. And so this is in 1973, 1974, quite early, and there were a number of students there in Tibetan studies, learning the Tibetan language. An amazing group of people, including Jose Cabezon, who at that time was wearing his robes, and so we'd see these two robed figures, Geshe Sopa and Jose Cabezon, walking around the campus or riding up and down in the elevators. So I saw them, and I sat in on various lectures, but Tibet seemed far, far away, too far away, and I was really in Chinese and Southeast Asian studies to begin with. I'd lived in Indonesia for 3 years, so had an interest in that. And it's funny that swings back around to David Snellgrove, who ended up living in Indonesia for many years and collecting materials for the Library of Congress in Indonesia. Sorry, what was your question? Just about background.
Yeah, your background in publishing.
No, and then throughout the 1980s, for almost all of the 1980s, I lived in Hong Kong and worked for a publishing company there doing books on China, the first set of guidebooks on the regions of China, on individual provinces, some anthropological books, educational books, and I was a bookseller also, so I learned the hard and dirty world of selling books, and even selling books in China, which was a big a big challenge because of the censorship and restrictions. But I spent a lot of time not only editing, but carrying books to China, talking with booksellers, and negotiating with the Chinese government on what books would be allowed into China. So just for the sort of grounding of how the book world worked, more or less from top to bottom in a small publishing house, it was a really, really good, a good period.
How did you become interested in books? Why did you ever decide to be involved in publishing?
Yeah, I'd always loved books, bibliomania a little bit. My mother had written 3 children's books, and even as a boy, I remember she would sometimes come to as a guest speaker to the classroom and explain back in those days how a book was put together, far different from today. So I was aware of books, and then I wanted to do a guidebook myself on Yunnan province after my 2 years there. And so the publishing company in Hong Kong had that as a kind of carrot for me to follow, saying, you come and work and we will also publish your book on Yunnan, which eventually I did do.
And this was after your BA in the USA?
In the US, and after 2 years teaching at Yunnan University, where in fact my mother and I were a team, mother and son team. If you want to know the full story, there was an article in the National Geographic magazine on me and my mother, 2 American teachers in China. June 1981, if you want to have a look, but it's a little bit silly, but it gives a good background of China just opening up. Deng Xiaoping, of course, he consolidated power in 1978, and one of the first steps he took was to slowly begin to open up China, and of course to normalize relations with the United States, which formally was announced at Christmas in 1978. And by February of 79, my mother and I were in China, so things moved quickly. That was something about a difference between Michael and Anthony. I think the farthest Michael would ever go would be to say, damn. Anthony, on the other hand, a great bouquet of words.
Yeah, that's right. I knew Anthony.
Yeah. People said, he was the bon vivant, where Michael took the academic line. In a parallel way, Anthony took, the commercial business line. Indeed, publishing is a business, but the two complemented each other extremely well. And the fact that Serindia, under Anthony's guidance, of course, kept a very high standard of quality. But Anthony was always able to consult with Michael about the content and the people and the contributors. And I think what's important to remember is that Anthony, in his way, of course, was also a genius, and that he would get so many ideas and people coming to him saying they wanted to publish, and many of them, really exciting or colorful ideas. And Anthony would quietly and slowly sift. He would sift through these until he got to what he really thought was of quality and could work commercially. And as you see, in any one year would produce 2, 3, or 4 books, having received ideas for 20 books. And what Anthony was also very good at was to anticipate the popularity of a book and match the print run to that, and also pricing. And his great, probably the book he was most proud of was the Tibetan medical tankas, the 2-volume work. And that's a great grand story in itself, with many ups and downs, fits and starts. We get into whole stories of Russian mafiosi and finding the right materials to use and the right materials to copy, and anger and so forth. Robert Beer can tell you more about that story. But behind it all, also as a backstop, was Michael, so the two brothers, they complemented each other in an amazing way.
And would you know how they negotiated the topics of the books to publish, or the books they would publish? So they had a wide range.
Yes, as you can see, you go to the list. There's a heavy emphasis on art, art history, architecture, and this is Antony's love. But of course, he cared about text. He cared about scholarship. But it was in the area of the visual that was Antony's main approach. Quite a lot of photographic support as well, not just artworks. And he also produced some books of fine art. Again, I was in on discussions between the two brothers on Michael's books, on Hugh Richardson's books, and of course bumped into lots and lots of people along the way. But the final decision always came down to Antony, and it was a mixture of how the book was going to look, and its viability, and its contribution, of course, that it was an original contribution to the world of Tibetan studies.
And why did Antony consider the visual side so important?
Again, it's part of his personality. It's what turned him on. He just loved Tibetan art. And when he worked with people like Roberto Vitali, with Robert Beer, these things really got him going. Again, I never went into a deep discussion with him about his aesthetic choices, but as you can see in the books, high quality text to accompany. But some of them, the main point is to record this Tibetan heritage. He, of course, considered Ser India to be a book on Tibet and the Himalayas, a fair amount of stuff from surrounding areas, a little bit on China. Antony shied away, or purposely, of course, chose not to do too much with China. He felt that was for other people. But again, if you look at the book list, he, over time, spread out to other areas. And then when Shane Suvikapakornkul from Thailand bought Ser India from Antony, the book publishing went in many, many different directions, including quite a lot of books on China, Southeast Asia, and now just about anything under the sun.
And in these discussions with Antony and Michael on the books, what were your roles? So you were the editor?
Yes. In my case, it could be anything from being a proofreader to actually spending time at the computer, making thousands of changes. I did not work on layout. Antony was very particular about who he worked with as his graphic designers, sometimes paying a lot of money to get good graphic designers to produce these large, fairly intricate books. And so for myself, it was usually on the word side, although when it came to photographs, then I got heavily involved, and I was hired, or part of my work was to spend a lot of time as a picture editor and tracking down photography at the Royal Geographic Society, at the Pitt Rivers, at the National Geographic Society in Washington, D.C., at the Arnold Arboretum in Boston, libraries and collections and archives all over the place. So in the area of photography, I was quite involved. And just as an aside, I was once hired for 2 years by Tibet House, New York, to travel around the world and locate archives or collections of old photographs of Tibet. And it was actually called the Old Tibet, I can't even remember the name, the Old Photographic Archive of Tibet, something like that. And so, for example, I even went to Japan and found some, I won't call them lost archives or collections, but at least to consolidate and understand what photographic material on Tibet existed in Japan, going back to earliest photography of Tibet, early 1900s. Also, Sir India never published it, but they have the materials and could publish the book of the very first photographs taken in Tibet in the 1890s. I think we can say that fairly, by Buryat Russians.
Was there an outcome of your trip, of this project?
Yes, in that Tibet House, New York keeps examples. I was able I can't remember now, but in 4 or 5 cases to actually get duplicates of photographs and archives. So these are there, as well as my reports on these photographic archives. And I have a document which shows where photography is, Tibet photography all over the world.
And at that time when you were putting the books together, it was done manually. It was what technology?
We were into the computer age, but in the 90s, yes, there was an awful lot of hands-on work. But we got to a point where you would simply send a file to the printer when the book was ready digitally. And it was the transition area of doing color separations with film at a color separator to finally into the transition of everything being done on the computers.
So how much time would it take to produce a book? The books that you have made with Anthony, the Raven Crown and the...
It would vary quite a bit. The quality of the writing, the volume, that is the extent. Is it 100 pages of text or is it 300 pages of text? Yeah, every book has a story, that's for sure. There's no such thing as an easy book, although in my life I've edited at least 100 books, and coming out number one of the cleanest, best book ready to go from the author, that goes to Per Caverna, that he was meticulous in preparation, and so that book went very quickly. I went up to Oslo in 1994, end of 1994, again worked with imagery and a bit of rewording of these quite elaborate translations of Bonput texts into English just to get the wording right. But apart from that, the book was ready to go.
And it was the book on Bonpo iconography.
Correct. I think the title is The Bon Religion.
Yeah, I
And
think
then
so.
in the subtitle we have the word iconography. I can't even remember now, but yeah, that was published, if I remember correctly, in '95. Yeah, so some books would take years because of delays. You can find 1,000 reasons why books don't get finished quickly. The main point is that book publishing involves a lot of people and a lot of egos, and because books are imbued with a kind of value, people get very, very quirky and very odd and very defensive sometimes about books and about what's going to be presented to the world under their name. And so every book is a story, and authors can get very weird, and many books fall by the wayside. Books, and then even after publication, Anthony experienced many times, or several times, regrets because of things not being done the way the author expected or the way Anthony expected. Copyright problems, payment problems, all of these things. But by and large, you can absolutely say Serindia was a successful publishing company, and its contribution is huge.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And which book you think was the most difficult?
Gosh. Well, when when David Snellgrove came around with his huge manuscript about his life, here's an example of a book that would seem obvious for Serindia to publish. But Anthony had a look at the manuscript and immediately knew that this was not for him. And so the book went over to Hal Kuloy, and it's a great tragedy that Hal died young. In fact, Anthony, I think, cut his teeth in publishing with Hal Kuloy, who supervised the renewing and republication of a great many historical manuscripts and in India through Indian presses. So Anthony passed David's autobiography to Hal Kuloy, who did publish it. That book was the most troublesome for me.
And which book you think was the most successful one?
Well, in terms of standing the test of time, certainly the gathering together Hugh Richardson's material for High Peaks, Pure Earth is one of them. As I mentioned, Anthony felt that the medical tankas was probably his greatest contribution. But we have books on the Kumbum at Gyantse, books on textiles, amazing books. At some point you could talk to Marie-Laure more about that, because she would have a more intimate understanding of Anthony's relationship with his books. And you can make a joke, because she makes a joke that she's never read any of those books, but she certainly has been a big part in their production in the background. And she also has a strong feeling for the visual, for the colorful, and so absolutely was a part of the visual presentation of the books, never mind that she didn't read the boring, dusty academic stuff.
And which book did you most enjoy working on?
I think I would have to say working with Michael on the Bhutan book on Buddhist monarchy, the most actual fun, because it was not difficult. Michael and I, we clicked. We had a huge amount of just playfulness putting this book together. Yeah, it involved a lot of work, but it was a kind of harmonious production. Yeah.
So maybe we could move on to Hugh Richardson.
Mm-hmm.
If you could say how you first met him, how you became to know him, and say something about the work that you've done with him.
In fact, it was at the time when Michael was at Harvard, and again, I'm not sure exactly if it was 1990 or 1991, but that could be checked. But the Dalai Lama was coming to America, to New York, and also to Boston, if I remember. And there was some kind of a conference going on. And so a great many people descended on Boston, and Samten Karme and Hugh Richardson were two of those. And because Michael was so busy, he said, "Paddy, go on, take care of them." And so I did. And so I had the good fortune for about a week to be with Hugh and Samten, and to make sure they were settled okay, and taking them to restaurants. And with Hugh, I was asked to escort him to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and that I could say was, although I'd met him at a dinner before, that was the first day that we really spent a lot of time together. And he seemed quite gruff at first, a bit bossy, and he absolutely wanted to make sure that I called him Hugh and not Mr. Richardson or Dr. Richardson or anything like that. And so he corrected me. But in fact, when we talked on common themes, you could see that in fact he was a very thoughtful and profound person. He had spent a number of years in Chongqing during World War II as the representative of British India. And so his early years of the late 30s and early 40s in Tibet, and I don't know exactly, it could be found out, the years in Chongqing when the Japanese were busy bombing. So we had quite a lot to talk about, because I knew Yunnan and Sichuan, the two main provinces of so-called Free China during the Second World War. Yeah, and that I had also, as a boy, lived for 6 years in South Asia, and Hugh loved to tell stories of his pre-Tibet life when he was district commissioner in Loralai in Baluchistan, and then later, of course, he was in Bengal. He mastered these languages. He still loved reading Bengali poetry. And this is all before becoming a great Tibetan scholar, so we see some of the depth and amazing qualities of Hugh Richardson. And just while I'm on the subject, when he was at Loralai, there was the great Quetta earthquake, and he rushed there. He rushed to Quetta, and he didn't like to talk about it because it was such a drastic and horrible thing. Not only the thousands dead, but the fact that the women and children were being kidnapped and raped, and he said he spent his time really under the greatest pressure trying to save and bring into a safe place as many women and children as possible. And I don't know how old he was, but he would have just been a young man, maybe in his 20s or early 30s then. So that gave me some insight into him. And later, of course, through Anthony, I got to know Hugh better and better through book publications. And I went twice up to St. Andrews in Scotland to be with him for a number of days and be at ease, and where I would stay in a B&B, but then spend between 10 or 12 hours a day with him, preparing his books, but largely going over his photographic material and organizing it. So I saw Hugh on and off through the years. Sometimes he would come to some opening, some museum opening in London. I saw him in both Boston and New York. And then these two trips up to St. Andrews, where he was. He didn't like London. No, he said. Each time I saw him, he'd say, "This is my last trip." But the book that I worked most closely on is called Ceremonies of the Lhasa Year. It was a book that Hugh had thought about for a long time. It wasn't an afterthought. He'd just never gotten around to it. But he had that direct experience of living through the cycle of ceremonies, festivities, rituals through the Tibetan year numerous times. And he had, in fact, I haven't done the counting, but I believe that the majority of his photography, or certainly a good big part of his photographic collection, would be related to these ceremonies, because these were formal occasions where he would be attending and sitting with his camera, and at different times during different years, but often indeed the same ceremony coming around again. And so he was in an outstanding position to both write his own impressions, present his own photographs, and then, of course, to have it all correctly presented from the Tibetan point of view, understanding of the lunar calendar, and so forth. And so it was very much a real collaboration of matching text to photographs. And that's where it was useful, I think, for me to be there, helping to choose the best pictures to match the text, sometimes adjusting the text, putting it together. And the layout followed itself, because you begin with the new year and then progress through the seasons until you come around again. It's black and white photography in this case. But what we also did in the case of the color slides, Hugh had a collection of, as I remember, 100, possibly 101 color slides, which he allowed me to arrange through a lab to be duplicated, and we gave one set to the British Museum. The British Museum, not the British Library, but the British Museum, also had a miscellaneous collection of photographic prints, not the negatives. Hugh kept his negatives in these special wallets and they were well organized, well kept, but the prints themselves in a great jumble, in envelopes, in sleeves, in piles. And so for ceremonies of the last year, the most important thing, of course, was to find the relevant photographs for that book. And so the first trip was working on that. And then also with the 100 slides, it was wonderful. I would say one of the more pleasant few days of my life was sitting with Hugh Richardson with a slide projector, projecting the pictures on the wall of his living room, and then just letting him talk with me taking notes, because he'd never made captions for these photographs. And so I was scribbling like crazy. I don't know why I didn't use a tape recorder, but I just did it by hand, and it seemed to work all right. And Hugh was very careful about what was attributed to him. He was a diplomat. He knew the value of words. I think at numerous times in his life, he came up against accusations about his attitudes towards Tibet. And so he wanted to be sure that what I eventually made available publicly, he wanted to see it first. So I said, absolutely. And so I typed up my notes and sent them back. And his main complaint was that they were too long and too revealing of his own person, too revealing of Hugh Richardson. He didn't like that. And so he asked that I reduce the length of the captions and keep the captions just on the subject in the picture. Because when he was talking and going on, he revealed a fair amount about himself. But he didn't want that in that writing up of the captions. So that was interesting for me to see also. Otherwise, he approved and he was happy to do this. He said he wanted to do it for a long time. He was quite funny because the photographs of the Potala duplicated themselves a number of times, and he would just wave his hand and say, "That old thing again. Oh, not that old thing again."
So at this point, where were you based and where Hugh Richardson was based?
Right. Again, I don't know the chronology of Hugh's life. I just know that he stayed in Tibet all the way to late 1948 or into 1949. This could be checked. Of course, the communists came to power in 49, in October 1st. Mao Zedong gave his great speech in Tiananmen Square that China has stood up. And it was in 1950 that two armies invaded Tibet, one from Qinghai, one from Sichuan, and certainly Hugh was long gone by then. But nevertheless, he stayed until quite late, and you can check the years, but he went to Seattle, Washington, and taught at the University of Washington in Seattle. That Terrell Wiley was there, and a number of Tibetans of the Sakya family. And so that was a place for him to be for a number of years. And then I don't know the story, except by the time that I went to see him in St. Andrews, Hugh was an old man. He was in a what do we call an old folks home, a nursing home, but largely able to look after himself. He could cook. He could get a hot meal there. He liked his whiskey, and he he had a number of whiskey bottles, and he'd point to them and say, "Now that's really precious." And some days he would be feeling grumpy or frustrated, and he'd give us sort of a sly look and say, "I think maybe it's time," and he'd have a little whiskey, but that's all right. But that experience of working with him closely and bringing up his memories of the past, that was, very, very important, quite moving for me, because I felt that I was able to touch and to feel and to experience Tibet in the 1930s and 40s, because here was the man better than anyone else who had lived through that and had the intelligence, the education, and really the spirit of the place, and it really came across. He didn't like to talk about himself personally very much. In High Peaks, Pure Earth, there is one chapter where he does reflect a bit on himself and his role. And then one anecdote that sticks out particularly, and he liked to tell, was that in the, I don't know which year, but it must have been 1940 or 1941, he was traveling in southern Tibet, in Lodra, and he was on his horse. He had his favorite horse, and at a monastery, and I could find the name, but I don't have it right now, he was invited, of course, to stay there, given hospitality. A room was cleaned out and given to him. He said it was pretty clean. And then a little delegation of the monks, and maybe the head lama, I don't know, but they cautiously came and knocked on his door and politely presented themselves. But the message was this. They asked him, "Mr. Richardson, would you like us to grind Hitler's soul?" And then Hugh let out a little laugh, and he said, "Well, you know, I was a diplomat, and so I declined." But this whole story of grinding Hitler's soul, and the monks said everything was ready, the preparations were there for the ceremony of the great grinding. So that these are the kinds of things that I don't think he ever wrote down, but such stories would pop up from time to time in his telling.
Which year would have been this?
Well, of course, the war would have started, so I'm guessing 40 or 41, because for most of the war he was in Sichuan. Again, we could perhaps through research figure out which monastery and when this was, but he liked telling that story.
Maybe they did the grinding in the end.
Maybe the war could have ended a bit sooner.
But at which point did you meet him? When he was in the USA?
Yes, the first time would have been in that intense period when I was working with Michael. The Nobel Prize for Aung San Suu Kyi had just been announced, and there was a conference also all happening. So I'm thinking it was 1990, but that would be easy to check. Yeah, and then Hugh and I, we kept up a correspondence. He was interested in my experience in Yunnan, in the border areas. He said that border area studies was really important, although he had spent so much time in Lhasa, of course. and that, there too, he early on saw something that now has sort of come to fruition, and border studies are kind of a big deal. And he was the one who really encouraged me and pushed me to try and look historically at the links between China and Tibet. What were the strong themes? Hugh was endlessly talking about the importance of geography. He said all history has to go hand in hand with geography. So he was directly responsible for turning me more from China to the border areas, and then indeed into Tibetan studies.
So which books you have worked with him on?
With Hugh, Ceremonies of the Last Year and High Peaks. Those were the two big projects. And then in doing those two books with him, really I could say perhaps the most valuable work I did was to help organize his photography, and to get those captions correctly done, and to have it organized in a way. And I think we can see that his material now at the Pitt Rivers Museum, is in accessible form. It's too bad he didn't write more about his photography, but nevertheless, a huge contribution that Hugh made.
So you took part in arranging the collection that ended up in the Pitt Rivers Museum?
Yes, I wasn't involved in the actual handover or transfer. Actually, I am responsible for locating a so-called lost collection, of securing it, and then, although it was in my possession, I gave it to the Pitt Rivers Museum, and it's the so-called MacDonald collection, which are the photographs of Henry Martin, who was a radio operator who went up to Tibet with the Young Husband expedition and then worked at the trade agencies in both Yadong and Gyangtse. And so I was able to secure those photographs, and they're now part of the photographic collection at the Pitt Rivers.
So how was the collection lost, and how did you find it?
There are, as far as I understand, I think 3 Henry Martin groups of photographs. Philip Grover at the Pitt Rivers has done the cataloging and knows the story more fully. But in this case, David MacDonald's daughter, she had in a private album this material, along with other family material and other Tibet-related and border area material. And I went and I found her. And she was living in Kent with her husband, who was a former British military man in India. And to my huge surprise, after tea and discussion, she said, "Excuse me." She went away and she came back with an envelope and said, "Oh, these are for you." And it was these Henry Martin photographs. And so, I thought that was a wonderful and amazing gift. And then in time, of course, realized I made copies for myself. I have a set private for myself, but then I gave the originals through Claire Harris to the Pitt Rivers.
And how do you remember the environment of the University of Washington when Hugh was there? Did you spend some time there?
I did not. And this would have been in the 1950s when I was just a boy. So I don't know, but I think maybe Marie-Laure would have some information on that. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't even know the exact years when he was in Washington, but he would have been an example of one of those rare flames that contributed absolutely to the field of Tibetan studies here in the at that time in the United States, and certainly an important catalyst. Yeah, I think I have to stop.